In the summer of 1981, Ruth Bellamy paid $214 for 7,000 fish nobody else wanted. The men at the hatchery laughed so hard, one of them spilled coffee down the front of his shirt. Because to them, Ruth had just bought a truckload of trouble. To her, she had bought a clock. And if she could keep that clock alive long enough, every pond on her dead farm was going to start paying her back. Ruth was 31 years old when Bellamy Bottom came to her. Not as a gift, not really. It arrived with a deed, 2 past-due bank notices, 4 irrigation ponds gone thick as carpet, and a house that still smelled like her father's pipe tobacco. Her father, Gideon Bellamy, had been buried 3 weeks before the county started telling Ruth what a sensible woman would do: sell the North 40, lease the rest, drain the ponds, move into town before grief made her stubborn. The people of Drew County, Arkansas, did not mean to be cruel. Most of them thought they were being practical. They could see what Ruth could see. 4 long ponds cut into the black delta soil, each one choked with water primrose, coontail, duckweed, and green scum so dense a dog could have mistaken it for grass. Mosquitoes lifted off the banks in gray clouds. The water had a sour smell in August. Sunlight hit the weed mats and stopped there, as if the ponds themselves had forgotten how to breathe. An old cotton farmer named Eli Pruitt stood beside Ruth at the fence one evening, chewing slowly and looking over the property like a doctor who had already signed the death paper. "Your daddy was a fine man," he said. Then he nodded toward the green ponds. "But that water's done. Don't let it take you with it." Ruth did not answer him. She was holding one of her father's ledgers against her ribs. Not a diary, not exactly. Gideon Bellamy had kept books the way some men kept preppers: soil temperatures, rainfall, fish weights, plant growth, water clarity measured with a white coffee saucer tied to twine, notes from extension pamphlets, notes from letters, notes from 3 trips he had taken to visit fish farms in Louisiana, Texas, and once, years before, across the Pacific with a church agricultural delegation. His handwriting was thin and patient. A man could read those pages and think they were records. Ruth read them and heard instruction. One sentence appeared in the margins again and again: "Dead water is not dead, it is only crowded." That was the sentence Ruth carried with her the morning she drove her father's blue Ford pickup to the state hatchery outside Monticello. The hatchery yard smelled of mud, diesel, and warm fish water. Behind a row of concrete tanks, Amos Reed was arguing with a young hand about feed waste. Amos was the kind of man who had spent 25 years around ponds and believed that made him the final word on anything wet. He had a round belly, a sunburned neck, and a pencil behind one ear he never seemed to use. When Ruth introduced herself, his expression softened for half a second. "Sorry about Gideon," he said. "Your daddy knew ponds better than most men with college letters after their names." Then his eyes sharpened with business. "What are you after?" "Catfish fingerlings." Ruth looked past him. In 8 long nursery tanks. The water flickered silver. Thousands of small fish moved in nervous sheets. "I'm here about the white Amur." Amos blinked. "The what?" "Your Amur fingerlings," Ruth said. "The ones the canal project canceled on." That got his attention. 6 months earlier, Amos had ordered a large batch of sterile white Amur after hearing a federal vegetation contract was likely to open along a drainage canal. The contract vanished. The fish did not. He had sold a few hundred to a golf course, and some to a duck club that regretted the purchase almost immediately. The rest sat in his tanks, eating feed, using space, and reminding him every morning that a man could be wrong in bulk. Amos gave Ruth a slow smile. Not friendly, interested. "Those little weed goats," he said. "What would you want with them? How many are left?" He laughed through his nose. "Too many." "How many?" He looked at the young hand, then back at Ruth. "Close to 7,000. Maybe 7,200 if the count's honest." I'll take the lot." Amos stared at her. Then the laugh came. It started in his chest and rolled across the yard loud enough that two men under the shade roof turned around. "Miss Bellamy," he said, wiping at one eye. "With all respect, you don't have ponds. Everybody knows what you've got out there. You've got 4 mosquito pits with fences around them." The young hand looked down to hide a grin. Amos kept going. "You put that many fish in that mess, you'll have a fish kill before Christmas. They'll smother, or the herons'll get them, or they'll rot under that salad you call water." Ruth waited until he finished. Then she asked, "What is your price?" That made him laugh again, but not as hard. He named a price so low it was almost an insult. $214 for the whole problem, if she brought her own transport and signed away complaint. He expected her to flinch. Instead, Ruth reached into the pocket of her work shirt and pulled out a folded bank envelope. The money was counted already. Amos's smile faded. For one brief second, he understood that she was not confused. Then he decided that made it worse. A fool could be forgiven. A determined fool was a danger to herself. "Suit yourself," he said, "but don't come back blaming me when they turn belly up." Ruth signed the release. By noon, the tanks were loaded into 2 borrowed flatbeds with aerators wired to truck batteries. Amos watched from the shade as she checked each hose, each strap, each water level. He mistook her care for anxiety. It was not anxiety, it was procedure. What Amos Reed did not know was that Ruth had spent 3 weeks at her kitchen table, reading Gideon Bellamy's notes until the words blurred. He knew white Amur ate weeds. That was common knowledge. A blunt fact, a cheap maintenance idea. Gideon had written something different. He called them converters. Not cleaners, not trash fish. Converters. They turn excess plant weight into living weight, he had written. The careless man sees a pond full of weeds and reaches for poisons. The patient farmer sees standing feed. There were sketches in the margin. Stocking rates, oxygen warnings, plant species ranked by preference. Notes on how clean water changed flesh quality, and on one page, tucked between a diagram of spillway screens and a calculation Ruth had to read 4 times, Gideon had written the line that changed everything. Large, clean Amur are not a disposal problem. In the right market, they are a premium live fish. Below it were names. Houston wholesalers, New Orleans buyers. Little notes about Asian restaurants, live tanks, transport stress, off flavor, and price differences between muddy pond fish and clear water fish. Ruth did not buy 7,000 fingerlings because she wanted weeds gone. She bought them because her father had shown her that a weed-choked pond was not a grave. It was inventory in the wrong form. The first year did everything it could to make her look foolish. For 5 months, the ponds looked almost unchanged. Ruth walked the levees every morning before sunrise, wearing rubber boots cracked at the heels and carrying a clipboard wrapped in a flour sack when it rained. She tested water with borrowed equipment from the county extension office. She repaired spillway screens by hand. She cut narrow channels through the weed mats so oxygen could move. She hauled a small pump from pond to pond and ran it when the nights turned too hot. Neighbors saw her on those banks and shook their heads. Poor Ruth, they said. Grief had got its teeth into her. At the feed store, men stopped talking when she came in. At church, women squeezed her arm a little too gently. Even the banker, Mr. Harlan Voss, tried kindness before pressure. "Ruth," he said one afternoon, sitting behind a desk polished by other people's worry, "nobody questions your daddy's mind. But land has to earn, and sentiment doesn't pay interest." Ruth looked at the papers in front of him. A note due in November. Another due in February. A farm that had not brought in real income in 2 years. "What are you saying?" she asked. He folded his hands. "I'm saying you should consider selling the east pasture before the bank has fewer options to offer you." That night, a storm came hard across the delta. Rain hammered the tin porch roof. Wind pushed water under the kitchen door. Ruth sat at the table with Gideon's ledger open, the bank papers beside it, and for the first time she let the county's doubt enter the room. Maybe Amos had been right. Maybe the ponds were too far gone. Maybe her father, brilliant as he was, had been writing about a possibility that only worked in cleaner water, better weather, richer hands. A line of lightning showed her reflection in the dark window. 31 years old. Alone. A farm mortgaged to the bone. 7,000 fish under a green cover nobody else believed could become anything but stink. She closed the ledger, and then she opened it again. Because tucked into the back pocket was a loose page she had not seen until that week. On it, Gideon had written a note to himself, not to her. The first sign will not look like success. It will look like a small patch of ordinary water. Ruth read that sentence 3 times. Then she stood up, put on her coat, and walked through the rain to the nearest pond with a lantern in her hand. The wind almost took the flame twice. She reached the bank, soaked through and angry at herself for needing proof. At first she saw only black water and shredded weeds. Then the lantern caught something near the spillway, a narrow opening, no bigger than a wagon bed, not clear, not pretty, just water, moving. Ruth stood there in the storm and laughed once, quietly, because nobody in Drew County would have called that success. But Gideon would have. By the end of the first summer, the openings widened. The duckweed thinned first. Then the coontail broke apart in ragged lanes. By the second spring, sunlight reached places it had not touched in years. Dragonflies returned, then frogs. Then kingfishers flashed blue along the cypress branches like living sparks. The ponds did not transform all at once. They surrendered one layer at a time. Ruth made no speeches. She kept records. Water temperature, dissolved oxygen, plant cover, fish growth. She did not call it faith. Faith was what people accused her of having when they could not see the arithmetic. This was work. By the second autumn, the white Amur were no longer fingerlings. They moved below the surface like pale shadows with shoulders. Some weighed 12 pounds, some more. The water, once sour and airless, had gone clean enough that Ruth could lower a saucer on twine and watch it disappear 6 feet down before the white edge blurred. That was when she began the second layer of Gideon's plan. She stocked 2 ponds with channel catfish, one with bluegill and largemouth bass. The last she kept mostly for Amur grow-out. The fish did what healthy water lets living things do. They grew, not fast like a miracle. Fast like a system finally stopped fighting itself. Then, in the spring of 1984, Ruth's private arithmetic met the outside world. A refrigerated truck out of Houston broke a rear spring outside a diner in Monticello. The driver was hauling live tanks for a seafood wholesaler named Daniel Lau, a quiet man who supplied restaurants that kept fish swimming until the morning they were cooked. The broken truck sat in the heat for 6 hours. By evening, the driver was desperate for clean holding water. Someone at the diner mentioned the Bellamy woman. "She's got ponds clear enough to shame a baptismal," the waitress said. That was how Daniel Lau came down the gravel road to Bellamy Bottom. Ruth found him standing at the edge of the first pond in polished shoes that were already taking mud, staring into the water. He was a man who bought fish for a living. He had seen plenty of fish, but he had not seen white Amur like these in Arkansas farm water. Big, clean, unscarred. No mud stink, no crowding damage, no chemical taste waiting under the skin. He crouched near the bank and watched one turn below the surface. "Who is your buyer?" he asked. "I don't have one yet," Ruth said. Daniel looked up at her. "Then you do now." The first contract did not make Ruth rich. That is important. It made her solvent. There is a difference. It paid the November note. It paid the feed bill. It repaired the North Levee. It let her replace the pump that had been coughing smoke since before Gideon died. Daniel bought every market-size Amur she would sell, live, and delivered with care. Then he bought catfish because the water made them taste clean. Then he sent a restaurant owner from Little Rock who wanted base for a private club. Money began to move into Bellamy Bottom, the way water moves when a blocked ditch is opened. Not a flood, a current, enough to change the shape of things. The farm got a new gate, then a working cooler, then a small concrete pad for sorting fish. Ruth hired 2 young men who had once repeated jokes about her ponds and now listened when she explained oxygen crashes. By 1986, the county had changed its language. People no longer called Bellamy Bottom dead land. They called it an operation. They no longer called Ruth stubborn. They called her sharp. But old contempt does not disappear. It waits for a reason to feel cheated. Amos Reed found his reason when he heard what Daniel Lau was paying for live, clean Amur. He heard it from a driver first, then from a restaurant man, then from a bank officer who should have known better than to gossip with numbers. 7 times what good catfish brought in the wrong season, sometimes more. Amos sat in his office at the hatchery and did the arithmetic on the fish he had sold Ruth for $214. He did it once, then again. Then he stopped because the answer insulted him. He still had access to white Amur stock, so he decided to grow his own. For 2 years, he fed them in a crowded hatchery pond behind the maintenance shed. They grew, not badly, but not like Ruth's. The water was hard used. The fish bumped concrete edges. Some carried sores, some tasted muddy. Amos did not understand that the market was not buying a species. It was buying a condition. Clean water, slow growth, low stress, careful handling. A reputation he had never bothered to build. He called Daniel Lau anyway. The conversation lasted less than 4 minutes. Daniel was polite, then final. He had a supplier. He had consistency. He had no need to risk his restaurant accounts on fish from a man who had discovered the market after someone else had disciplined it into existence. When Amos asked who the supplier was, Daniel told him, Bellamy Bottom. Amos did not speak, because in that moment the past did not feel like 5 years ago. It felt like yesterday. Ruth standing in his hatchery yard with a bank envelope in her shirt pocket, the men laughing. His own voice telling her she was throwing fish into a mosquito pit. He had not sold her fish. Not really. He had sold her the part of the future he had been too arrogant to recognize. A month later, Amos drove out to Bellamy Bottom, not in a company truck, in his own pickup. The new gate stood open. Beyond it, the road was graded smooth. The fences were tight. A small processing shed sat where a collapsed hay leaned to use to sag. The air smelled of wet clay, clean water, and cut grass. Ruth was at the sorting pad, sleeves rolled, calling weights to a boy with a pencil. She looked up when Amos stepped out. Her face did not change. That was worse than anger. Anger would have meant he still mattered in the story. This was simply recognition. Miss Bellamy, he said. Mr. Reed. He looked past her at the holding tanks, at the aerators, at the healthy fish flashing below the surface, at the 2 young workers waiting for her next instruction. Then he looked at the main pond, the one he had called a mosquito pit. The water was clear enough to show the shadows of fish moving over sand. How did you know? He asked. It came out smaller than he intended. Ruth set the clipboard down. She could have reminded him of the laughter. She could have quoted the receipt. She could have told him exactly what those 7,000 fish had become in weight. Contracts, debt paid down, and years bought back. Instead, she gave him the answer he at least prepared himself to hear. My father taught me that water keeps books, she said. Most men only read the price tag. Amos looked away. The line landed because it was not clever. It was exact. He had read the price tag. $214. Inventory relieved. Problem gone. Ruth had read the whole ledger. Plant weight, fish weight, oxygen, time, taste, market trust. The things a cheap man cannot count because they do not look like money yet. He cleared his throat. I was wrong, he said. Ruth waited. I've got access to stock, better stock than before. We could make an arrangement. I can supply fingerlings. You grow them out. We split contracts, expand into 3 counties, maybe more. He tried to make it sound generous. It sounded hungry. Ruth glanced toward the ponds. 5 years earlier, she would have needed the offer to be real. Now she could recognize the hook inside it. Amos did not want to build with her. He wanted to enter after the risk had passed and call that partnership. Thank you, Ruth said, but my arrangements are already made. His mouth tightened. You're turning down growth. No, she said. I'm turning down hurry. That was the part Amos never understood. Hurry had cost him the future once already. He had hurried to buy into a government contract before it existed. Hurried to dump the fish when it vanished. Hurried to mock the woman who moved slower than he did. Then hurried to copy her without learning the method underneath. Ruth had not moved slowly because she was timid. She had moved slowly because ponds punish impatience. A pond will show every shortcut. Too many fish, and the oxygen collapses. Too much feed, and the bottom fouls. Too much greed, and the water starts keeping that account too. Amos left with no deal. Behind him, Ruth returned to the sorting pad. The workers waited. The fish moved. The day went on. And that was the victory, not a speech, not revenge, continuation. Over the next 20 years, Bellamy Bottom became the farm extension agents, brought visitors to see when they wanted to explain integrated pond management without boring people to death. College students came with notebooks. County men came with questions they tried to make sound casual. Ruth answered most of them. She taught stocking rates, aeration, harvest timing, how to smell a pond before it turned dangerous, how to watch birds because birds noticed imbalance before men with clipboards did. She paid fair wages. She turned down debt more often than she turned down profit. She expanded by 1 pond at a time, never faster than the water could teach her. The ledgers grew. Gideon's thin handwriting filled the early books. Ruth's stronger hand filled the rest. By the time she was 68, there were 27 ledgers in a cedar chest beside her kitchen table. The first one still held the page with the sentence that had saved her in the storm. The first sign will not look like success. It will look like a small patch of ordinary water. One October evening, Ruth sat on the bank of the original pond with her grandson, Caleb, a boy of 13, who asked more questions than he answered, and had begun carrying a pencil behind his ear for no reason, except that he had seen old photographs of Gideon doing it. The sunset turned the water bronze. A kingfisher struck the surface and rose with a flash of silver. Ruth placed 1 old ledger and 1 empty one on the grass between them. Your great-grandfather wrote what he noticed, she said. I wrote what I had to learn the hard way. Caleb ran his fingers over the cracked cover. What am I supposed to write? Ruth watched the pond for a long moment. Then she smiled. Start with what everybody else is stepping over. The story was never really about fish. Fish were only the figures in the account. It was about the kind of knowledge that looks useless until the season changes. It was about a woman who understood that decay is sometimes just value trapped in the wrong form. Amos Reed saw 7,000 unwanted fingerlings. Ruth Bellamy saw a system waiting for an honest keeper. The county saw dead water. She saw water too crowded to breathe, and once she gave it time, room, and work, the water had been keeping its own books all along.